December 7, 1941, marked a turning point in history. On that day, the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was swift, deadly, and devastating, sinking multiple battleships, killing over 2,000 Americans, and dragging the United States into the Second World War. Japan's aim was to cripple the American Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with Japanese plans to dominate Asia and the Pacific. But instead of breaking America's will, the attack united the nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and the very next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. What followed was a brutal and complex campaign in the Pacific, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean and involving countless battles on land, sea, and air. This is the story of how the United States defeated Japan in World War II. In the months following Pearl Harbor, America began one of the largest military mobilizations in history. Men volunteered and were drafted by the millions. Factories that once built cars began producing tanks, airplanes, and weapons. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, building the machines of war and keeping the economy running. The entire country was focused on defeating the Axis powers. While American troops were being trained and equipment built, Japan expanded rapidly, taking the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and large parts of Southeast Asia. But the United States was preparing to strike back. The first American offensive action came in April 1942, with the Doolittle Raid-on air raid on Tokyo, using bombers launched from an aircraft carrier. Though the damage was minimal, it shocked the Japanese and lifted American morale. It showed that Japan was not invincible, and that the U.S. could reach its homeland. Meanwhile, Japan planned to eliminate the U.S. presence in the Pacific once and for all. Their goal, to lure American forces into a trap at Midway Atoll. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 would prove to be one of the most decisive battles of the war. Thanks to American codebreakers, the U.S. knew Japan's plans ahead of time. Admiral Chester Nimitz set up an ambush. When the Japanese fleet arrived, American dive bombers struck with deadly precision, sinking for Japanese aircraft carriers in a matter of hours. The loss of those carriers, along with their trained pilots, was a devastating blow to Japan's naval power. From that point on, Japan would never regain the upper hand in the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States moved quickly. The country had been shocked, but not broken. Almost overnight, the nation began to prepare for war. Millions of men signed up to join the military. Some were drafted, but many volunteered. Young men from cities, farms, and small towns lined up to serve. At the same time, American factories started changing what they produced. Car companies stopped making cars and began building tanks, trucks, and airplanes. Shipyards worked day and night to build warships and cargo ships. The U.S. was turning its economy into a machine for war. This transformation wasn't just about weapons, it was about people too. While men went off to fight, women stepped into roles they had never had before. They worked in factories, offices, and shipyards. They built planes, packed supplies, and kept industries running. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of the strong, capable women helping win the war from home. Even teenagers helped by collecting scrap metal, growing food in victory gardens, and selling war bonds. The American government also helped direct the war effort. It created new agencies to control supplies, ration food, and manage production. Materials like rubber, gasoline, and steel were saved for the military. People used ration books and learned to do more with less. Everyone was expected to support the war. Movie theaters showed news from the front. Posters reminded people to work hard, save resources, and stay silent about military secrets. The whole country was focused on one goal: victory. In just a few short years, the United States became the most powerful industrial force in the world. It produced more weapons, ships, and planes than any other country. While Japan struggled with limited resources, America had fuel, factories, and manpower. This massive effort gave us forces the tools they needed to fight across the vast Pacific Ocean. Mobilizing the superpower wasn't easy, but it gave the Allies a powerful advantage that would help turn the tide of the war. Asterisk. In June 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States faced a major test in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had a new plan to attack the island of Midway, a small but important U.S. base in the middle of the ocean. Their goal was to destroy the rest of the American fleet and take full control of the Pacific. But this time, things would be different. American codebreakers had been working hard to crack Japanese messages. They figured out that AFD target in the Japanese plan meant Midway. This gave the U.S. a huge advantage. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, prepared a trap. He sent 3 aircraft carriers to wait near Midway and told the base to get ready for battle. On June 4th, the Japanese launched their attack. Planes bombed Midway, but the U.S. was ready. American planes flew out to strike back, but many were shot down. Then, at just the right moment, American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers. In just a few minutes, they hit 3 of them, setting them on fire. Later that day, a 4th Japanese carrier was destroyed. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and many of its best pilots. It was a huge defeat. The U.S. lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, but the damage to Japan was far worse. The Battle of Midway was the turning point in the Pacific War. From this moment on, Japan would be on the defensive. Midway showed that the U.S. could match and beat Japan at sea. It gave American forces hope and proved that the tide of war was starting to turn. What began as a fight for survival was now becoming a push toward victory. Asterisk. After the victory at Midway, the United States began a long and difficult campaign called island hopping. The goal was simple but dangerous. Take back key islands, one by one, moving closer and closer to Japan's home islands. Instead of trying to capture every island the Japanese controlled, American forces targeted the most important ones, with airfields, harbors, or locations that could help launch future attacks. The first major test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. American Marines landed on the island to take control of an airfield under construction by the Japanese. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting. The jungle was thick, the weather was harsh, and the enemy refused to give up. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but in February 1943, the Japanese finally retreated. It was the first major land victory for the United States in the Pacific. From there, U.S. forces continued moving west. They captured the Gilbert Islands, then the Marshall Islands, and eventually the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These victories were not easy. Japanese soldiers often refused to surrender, fighting to the last man. American troops had to fight through booby traps, hidden tunnels, and deadly ambushes. In many cases, the enemy would launch desperate banzai charges or commit suicide rather than be captured. The battle for Saipan in 1944 was especially brutal. Thousands of Japanese civilians lived on the island, and many were convinced by military propaganda that the Americans would torture or kill them. In a heartbreaking scene, hundreds of civilians jumped from cliffs to their deaths rather than surrender. American troops tried to stop them, but fear and lies had taken hold. This tragedy showed how deeply the war had affected not just soldiers, but ordinary people as well. After taking Saipan and nearby islands, the U.S. built airfields that allowed bombers to reach the Japanese mainland. This was a major step toward the final stages of the war. Japan was now within striking distance, but more blood would be shed before peace could come. The island-hopping campaign was slow and costly, but it brought the United States closer to victory. One hard-fought step at a time. As American forces moved closer to Japan, the fighting grew even more intense. Each new island brought new challenges. One of the most important and deadly battles took place on the island of Iwo Jima, just 750 miles from Japan. Iwo Jima was a small island, but it held great value. If captured, it could serve as a base for American bombers and provide a place for damaged planes to land after missions over Japan. The battle began on February 19, 1945. American Marines stormed the beaches under heavy fire. The Japanese had spent months digging tunnels, bunkers, and caves all over the island. They were ready, and they fought from hidden positions. Progress was slow, and every inch of land had to be taken by force. The battle lasted more than a month. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and over 20,000 were wounded. The Japanese lost almost all of their 20,000 soldiers, many of them choosing death over surrender. One of the most famous moments of the war happened. During this battle, the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi, a photograph of that moment became a symbol of hope and courage, showing that even in the darkest times, the fight could be won. But the price was high, and the bloodshed was far from over. Just a few weeks later, U.S. forces landed on Okinawa, an island even closer to Japan. This battle would become the largest and bloodiest of the Pacific War. It began in April 1945 and lasted nearly 3 months. Over 180,000 American troops took part. The Japanese, knowing this might be their last chance to stop the invasion of their homeland, fought with everything they had. They used kamikaze pilotsmen, who flew planes filled with explosives into American ships, willing to die to take out their enemies. The numbers from Okinawa are staggering. Over 12,000 Americans killed, more than 36,000 wounded, and around 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead. Like at Saipan, many civilians were convinced that surrender meant torture, and many chose suicide. The horror of Okinawa shocked American leaders. If this much blood was spilled on one island, what would it take to invade Japan itself? These two battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, signs of how fierce the resistance would be if the U.S. tried to invade Japan. With each step closer, the fighting grew more desperate, and the losses on both sides increased. American leaders began to look for another way to end the war without launching a full-scale invasion. That way would come in a terrifying new form, one that would change the world forever. Asterisk. By the summer of 1945, Japan was severely weakened. Its navy had been mostly destroyed. Its cities were being bombed. Its people were running out of food, fuel, and hope. The United States had pushed closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, capturing key islands and cutting off supply lines. But even after the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japan refused to surrender. American leaders knew that invading Japan directly could cost hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of lives. They needed a way to end the war quickly. While the fighting raged in the Pacific, American scientists had been working on a secret weapon, the atomic bomb. This project, known as the Manhattan Project, brought together some of the world's top scientists in a race to develop a new kind of explosive. The idea was to release the energy trapped inside atoms, creating an explosion far more powerful than anything ever seen before. After years of work and billions of dollars, the first successful test was conducted in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. The explosion lit up the sky and left behind a giant mushroom cloud. The weapon was real and deadly. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April 1945, now faced a terrible decision. Should the U.S. drop the atomic bomb on Japan? Some advisors believed it would save lives by ending the war quickly. Others warned of the moral consequences and the destruction it would bring. In the end, Truman chose to use the bomb. He believed it was the fastest way to stop the killing and avoid a full invasion. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, the city was nearly destroyed. Tens of thousands of people died immediately, and many more would die in the days and weeks that followed, from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Again, the destruction was massive. The shock of these attacks, along with the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan and invading its forces in Manchuria, finally forced Japan to act. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast. It was the first time most of them had ever heard his voice. He explained that Japan must surrender to avoid more suffering and destruction. The war was over. The United States had achieved victory, but the world had changed forever. The atomic bomb had ended the fighting, but it also opened a new era of fear, one where nations could destroy each other in moments. Asterisk. After Japan announced its surrender, the world began to breathe again. On September 2, 1945, representatives from Japan boarded the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to officially sign the documents that ended the war. American General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the ceremony. With a stroke of a pen, World War II was finally over. The conflict had lasted more than 6 years, killed tens of millions of people worldwide, and changed the world in countless ways. Now came the challenge of rebuilding, not just cities and countries, but lives, societies, and peace. The United States occupied Japan after the war. General MacArthur was placed in charge of overseeing the transition. Instead of punishing the Japanese people harshly, the U.S. chose a different path, one focused on peace, rebuilding, and democracy. Japanese leaders who were responsible for war crimes were put on trial, but the country itself was given a chance to start over. The American occupation lasted until 1952, and during that time, major changes were made. Japan's military was dismantled, and its war industries were shut down. A new constitution was written that gave more rights to citizens, including women, who could now vote for the first time. The emperor, once seen as a god, remained as a symbol of the country, but lost all political power. Schools were reformed, land was redistributed, and the economy was rebuilt with American help. Slowly, Japan began to rise again, this time as a peaceful, democratic nation. For the United States, the end of the war brought great pride, but also new responsibilities. It emerged as one of the two superpowers in the world. Along with the Soviet Union, the alliance between them quickly turned into rivalry, leading to the Cold War. The atomic bomb, once seen as the key to ending World War II, became a symbol of global danger. Other countries began developing nuclear weapons, and fear of another, even deadlier war spread across the globe. The war in the Pacific had left deep scars. Thousands of American soldiers never returned home. Many who did were changed forever, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The same was true for the Japanese people, who faced incredible loss and suffering. But from the rubble rose a new world. The old empires were gone. A new world order was forming, one built on the lessons of war, the value of peace, and the hope for a better future. Asterisk. The war between Japan and the United States was one of the most intense and tragic chapters in human history. It was a war that stretched across oceans, jungles, skies, and cities. It involved millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. It saw unimaginable bravery, deep suffering, and the terrifying power of modern weapons. But more than anything, it changed the world forever. The story of this war is more than just battles and dates. It is the story of ordinary people in extraordinary times, of young men who fought on distant islands, of families who sacrificed at home, of scientists who unlocked new and dangerous power, and of nations forced to rebuild from ruin. The war showed how cruel humanity can be, but also how strong, united, and determined people can become when faced with great danger. For the United States, the war marked its rise as a global power. It showed the world what the country could do when fully united. Factories turned into war machines. Citizens rallied behind their troops, and the military became one of the strongest in history. But the cost was high. Thousands of American lives were lost. Families were forever changed, and veterans carried the memories of combat with them for the rest of their lives. For Japan, the war brought devastation and defeat, but also transformation. The country that once marched toward empire was rebuilt into a peaceful, modern democracy. Within a generation, Japan became a global economic power, not through war, but through innovation, industry, and cooperation. The pain of the past remained, but it helped guide Japan toward a future focused on peace and progress. Today, the legacy of the war still echoes. Monuments stand in honor of the fallen. Museums preserve the memories of those who served and suffered. History books try to explain how and why it all happened. and people from both nations, once fierce enemies, now shared deep ties of friendship, trade, and diplomacy. The former battlegrounds have become places of remembrance and learning. This story reminds us that war, no matter the cause, leaves deep scars. It reminds us of the cost of hatred, ambition, and unchecked power. But it also reminds us of the strength of the human spirit, our ability to rise from ashes, rebuild what was lost, and create a better world from the lessons of the past. The war between Japan and America in World War II was more than a military struggle. It was a clash of ideals, cultures, and visions for the future. In the end, it left behind not just destruction, but a deep understanding of the need for peace. That, perhaps, is the most powerful legacy of all. Asterisk.